The tragic truth about Mike Tyson's most personal rivalry. He was 12 years old when Cus D'Amato first put hands on his shoulders and told him he would be heavyweight champion of the world. That was not a prediction, that was a transaction. And like all transactions, it came with terms neither of them fully understood yet. The rivalry that would define Mike Tyson's life was never with Evander Holyfield. It was never with Lennox Lewis. It was not fought in any arena with a ring and a referee. It was fought inside a relationship so intimate, so psychologically loaded, that when it finally collapsed, it did not make a sound. It just left a man standing in the ruins of everything he had been built to become. And no one, not even Tyson himself, could agree on who had done the building and who had done the destroying. This is not a boxing story. It is a story about what happens when a child is saved and shaped by the same hands. By 1980, Mike Tyson had already been arrested 38 times. He was 11 years old. He grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, a neighborhood that did not raise children so much as it processed them. His mother, Lorna, was largely absent in the ways that mattered. His father was a ghost. What the streets offered him was speed, violence, and a temporary hierarchy built on fear. He was not a prodigy of boxing then. He was a prodigy of survival. Bobby Stewart, a juvenile detention counselor and former fighter, saw something in him. Not talent? Not yet. He saw controllable aggression. He brought Tyson to a trainer in Catskill, New York, a 72-year-old man named Constantine D'Amato, who had not managed a heavyweight champion in over 2 decades and who, by most accounts in the boxing establishment, had been written off as a relic. Cus D'Amato had 2 things left, a system and a hunger. He found a vessel in Tyson. The question history has never fully answered is whether D'Amato was rescuing a boy or recruiting one. The relationship moved fast in the way that all relationships move fast when one party has nothing and the other offers everything. Within months, Tyson was living in D'Amato's Victorian house in Catskill. He ate at his table. He trained in his gym. He slept under his roof. D'Amato legally became his guardian in 1983. By then, Tyson was already being shaped, not just physically, but philosophically, psychologically, almost mythologically. D'Amato did not simply teach Tyson to fight. He taught Tyson who he was. He told him he had no equal. He constructed a persona, the cold destroyer, the man without fear, and fed it to a teenager who had no competing narrative of himself. There was nothing else. No other story. No other author. Tyson later said that D'Amato told him he would be the youngest heavyweight champion in history. He said it so often with such certainty that Tyson began to believe it not as ambition, but as identity. The championship was not something he would do. It was something he already was, waiting to be confirmed. That is not coaching. That is architecture. And architecture determines what can be built and what cannot be dismantled without the whole structure falling. Cus D'Amato died in November 1985. Tyson was 19. He had not yet turned professional for a full year. He had never fought for a major title. The man who had created him, or saved him depending on who is telling the story, was gone before he could see what he had made. 13 months later, Tyson knocked out Trevor Berbick in 2 rounds and became, at 20 years old, the youngest heavyweight champion in history. Exactly as D'Amato had said. He stood in the ring afterward and wept. What followed was not triumph. It was acceleration without a governor. D'Amato had been the only person in Tyson's life who combined authority with genuine investment, who could tell him no and make it stick. Without him, the architecture remained, but the architect was gone. The structure held its shape for a while. Then the cracks began to show in the places D'Amato would have reinforced. Don King arrived, the money arrived, the entourage arrived. And quietly, methodically, everyone who had been placed in the orbit of Mike Tyson by D'Amato, trainer Kevin Rooney, manager Jim Jacobs, was removed, one by one, replaced by people whose relationship to Tyson was entirely transactional. The boy D'Amato had saved was now a commodity. The difference is not subtle. But Tyson, who had never been taught to see himself as anything other than what D'Amato told him he was, had no framework to recognize what was happening. The most devastating part of this story is not the fall. It is the timing of the fall and what it reveals about the foundation. In 1990, James Buster Douglas knocked Tyson out in Tokyo. The world treated it as an upset. Sports writers called it the biggest upset in boxing history. They were correct in the technical sense. But inside the story, inside the actual architecture of what Cus D'Amato had built, it was something else entirely. It was evidence. D'Amato's system had always been built around one specific psychological truth, that Tyson's power came not from skill alone, but from the belief that he was inevitable, that opponents had already lost before they walked in. When the training staff changed, when the preparation became careless, when Tyson arrived in Tokyo out of shape and emotionally distracted, the inevitability dissolved. And what was underneath it was not a man who had been taught to fight through adversity. It was a man who had been taught he would never face any. D'Amato had prepared Tyson for domination. He had not prepared him for doubt. That is not a failure of love. It may have been an excess of it. But the consequence was the same. The decades that followed were a long public reckoning with a private wound that never had the right name. The rape conviction in 1992, the prison sentence, the Holyfield fights, the first loss, the rematch, the bite, the chaos in the ring that night that looked to most people like madness but looked, to anyone paying attention, like a man who had no other language for what he was experiencing. The bankruptcies, the face tattoo, the managed chaos of a life that kept producing spectacle, because spectacle was the only thing anyone had ever rewarded him for. Tyson spoke about D'Amato throughout all of it, in interviews, in the documentaries, in the one-man show on Broadway where he stood alone on a stage for 2 hours and talked, really talked, about his life with a rawness that most public figures never approach. He returned to D'Amato again and again, not with resentment, but with something harder to articulate. Grief, yes, but also a kind of bewilderment. A man trying to understand the terms of a deal he signed before he was old enough to know what he was agreeing to. He once said, "Cus made me. Without Cus, I'm nothing." And then, in a different interview, years later, "I don't know who I am without boxing. I've never known." Those two statements are the same statement. The rivalry at the center of Mike Tyson's life was never with another fighter. It was with the version of himself that Cus D'Amato constructed, a version that was real enough to win championships and fragile enough to collapse the moment the man who built it was no longer in the room. What D'Amato gave Tyson was extraordinary by almost any measure: a home, a discipline, a future, a sense of self at an age when most children in Tyson's position had none. The record shows that. It cannot and should not be erased. But what D'Amato also gave Tyson, perhaps without knowing, perhaps without any other choice, was an identity that belonged entirely to boxing, a self that could not exist outside the ring, that had no contingency plan for ordinary life, that was never asked to develop the interior scaffolding that most people build slowly, quietly, through failure and reflection, and the accumulation of a life lived beyond performance. When Tyson lost, he did not just lose fights. He lost the only architecture that told him who he was. And no opponent, not Holyfield, not Lewis, not Buster Douglas, could ever be held responsible for that. The most personal rivalry of Mike Tyson's life was between the boy who needed saving and the weapon he was saved into becoming. That fight never had a final bell.